Can you hear me? I guess the sound should be good now. Good evening, Dan, and welcome. Tonight we're going to talk about good and evil. Should be an interesting discussion. Before I get to that, though, I want to answer one question by another subscriber, and he asked a question about this meme, which I put on to one of the videos a while back. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Okay, so I haven't found that specific quote, but I did find in Answer to Job, there is a section where Dr. Jung is talking about the individuation process. And he says, okay, so this is in paragraph 746. He says, the conscious realization of what is hidden and kept secret certainly confronts us with an insoluble conflict. At least this is how it appears to the conscious mind. But the symbols that rise out of the unconscious in dreams show it rather as a confrontation of opposites, and the images of the goal represent their successful reconciliation. Something empirically demonstrable comes to our aid from the depths of our unconscious nature. It is the task of the conscious mind to understand these hints. If this does not happen, the process of individuation will nevertheless continue. The only difference is that we become its victims and are dragged along by fate towards that inescapable goal which we might have reached walking upright. If only we had taken the trouble and been patient enough to understand in time the meaning of the noumena that cross our path. Okay, so that's half of that paragraph 746 from Answer to Job, but basically it's saying that what he means is that the individuation process anyway goes on, but your psyche gives you hints about what's best for you. And so it's best to try to understand what your unconscious is trying to tell you. Because if you don't do that, what happens is that you will nevertheless go through individuation, but instead you'll call it fate instead of making conscious decisions. And sometime soon I'll talk about my conscious decision in the last week, which is like that. But in any case, that's where that question comes from. So welcome, everyone. And so tonight we're going to talk about good and evil in analytical psychology. Now, this might be a little different from what you would expect. And so I'm going to talk through it as carefully as I can, and everyone can give me your views about it. So, paragraph 858, purely empirical aspect of good and evil. It's of a concrete fact. And one of the things that Dr. Jung talks about throughout this essay is how we allow ourselves to be deluded by words. We substitute words for the whole of reality. And what he means by that is that we let a word fit in place of the experience. For example, if we say warm, okay, we all have a concept of what warm is, but just because we say the tea is still warm doesn't mean if we touch the teapot, it's going to feel warm to us. In fact, it might feel hot to us. So what Dr. Jung is here talking about is what good and evil is as opposites in the consulting room, and keeping in mind that the church over 2 millennia has tried to deny evil, and that was the essence of last week's session in the advanced reading group, which for which the video is just going up as we speak. I'm sorry I got delayed this week because of a couple things that came up, but in any case, the video is edited now and is tracking over to the advanced reading group Dropbox, so you can hear it there. But in that video, one of the key elements is that the church was denying the existence of evil for the last 2,000 years, and they were doing that on a concept of privatio boni, which means privation of good. So Dr. Jung is rather facetious in that section in Ion, where he says that it's ridiculous to say that, because let's say that in the Arctic, the temperature seldom gets below 250 degrees above absolute zero. Well, the problem with that is that's not particularly warm. But if you took the church's way of thinking about evil, you would be using the same kind of logic. So anyway, so Dr. Jung well, let's finish with the church. The church didn't want to admit that evil existed, so it turned its back on evil, and the result was the 20th century, basically, because when the facade fell away, the facade of all the myths, the religious myths, fell away at the end of the 19th century. Plenty of evil came plowing through, and it's still with us. It's barely under control at any given time. But Dr. Jung doesn't know what evil is, what it is, because it depends on the situation. And so when someone speaks of good and evil, it is what he calls good and evil, and what he feels is good and evil. It isn't necessarily a solid fact per se. And so his point is that subjective facts, that is, facts which any one of us has in our minds, may not be in tune with real facts at all. And you know, what's real? What's a real fact? I mean, what's warm to you versus hot? You know, I guess that's a statistical truth, let's say. And so, anyway, Dr. Jung goes on in paragraph 859. And by the way, this essay appears in this book, which is Civilization in Transition. It's volume 10 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. And so the reason it's near the end of this book, and therefore the essay itself begins at paragraph 858. Let's see, I'm just trying to figure out how to get myself in the middle of this picture. There we go. I guess that's about as good as I can do. Okay. So anyway, good and evil are subjective facts, and they depend on the person. And they are in themselves principles, so they have existed long before we ever came along or our religions came along, and they will be there long after we are gone. And so what is good and evil in everyday life is a subjective judgment. And he tells the joke in paragraph 861 about a young Texas man who goes into the priest, and he says, well, I just murdered someone. And the priest says, how many? So I guess he could be absolved by the priest. I don't know. Priesthood absolution these days is a little bit suspect, I guess. And so anyway, in 862, he says that if we know in advance how things should come out, then we're behaving as a god. And in paragraph 863, he says, when we pass emphatic judgments, we are in an emotional state and least able to apply valid criteria. And so when we're, let's say, upset about the election come November, whatever the outcome, that's not a good time to be deciding who's good and who's evil in the political world. And so what he's saying in paragraph 864 is what happens to the therapist is that a patient presents with a conflict. They have a conflict that they're trying to deal with. And it's the therapist's job to find a way out of the conflict. And that's not always easy, and sometimes it's paradoxical. Let's see. And Dr. Jung makes the comment, very often he thinks to himself, I hope to God I'm doing the right thing in this case. And there are plenty of cases like that, I'm sure. So good and evil become principles of ethical judgment. And he comments that Rudolf Otto called them tremendum or fascinosum. And he says, I cannot conquer a numinosum. I can only open myself to it, let myself be overpowered by it, trusting in its meaning. And so when you have a conflict in your mind, maybe you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing with another woman or something like that, you're surely in hell at that time, because you have a conflict of duties, let's say, and it's there's no way out, and neither the priest or the psychotherapist is going to be able to help you with that, and you need to just find a way through. Let's see. In paragraph 865, he's saying, we only know the surface of things, how they appear to us, so we must be very modest in how we decide things. In the summer of 2016, in a class before election 16, I was talking about our president, and I said, well, if he's elected, I don't know whether it's good or bad. And I still don't, because it could be good and it can be bad. It just depends. And that judgment hasn't really changed. And we need to, I know what I think I want and what I think should happen in our country. But, if the president were removed in the next 2.5 years, I'm not sure that would be better for the country. I'm personally doubtful if it would be better for the country, given who would become president. And I have no idea how things can play out. There's a brilliant movie and a very funny movie that I urge everyone to see, and that movie is called Welcome to Happiness. And in this movie, there is an individual who is given a small door in one of his closets, or in his closet, and people show up at his door, and he talks to them, and then he lets them through this door in his closet, and he never sees them again. And he doesn't know why he's doing this, but this is his assignment because he rented this particular room in this particular apartment in this particular building. So he has to take it on as a job. And what is happening is people with very severe conflicts about ethics, mainly, come to him, and he's not supposed to solve the problem, but he hears what the problem is, and then he lets the people through the door. Well, on the other side of the door, there are people who help the individual that comes to the door to decide. And it's very interesting what happens. And one guy, for example, is suicidal when he comes to the door, and he goes through the door and he sees that, wow, his decision might have been the better one after all. So I urge you to see this movie. It's very good. Dan says, suppressing individual expression with dogmatic rules will lead to an eruption of the unconscious eventually. No avoiding it. Yep, absolutely. And that's also what happens with words, as we'll be discussing. Now, I wanted to read here. There's a little segment of this in paragraph 865 that I wanted to read, and so because I think it relates to the mistake that I think Jordan Peterson was making when he published 12 Rules of Life. Now, mind you, I don't think it was a mistake from his point of view, because I think he sold a lot of books, but let's just listen to this thing. He says, how often have I wished to get rid, so it seemed to me, of some absolutely harmful tendency in a patient, and yet in a deeper sense he was perfectly right to follow it. I want, for instance, to warn somebody of the deadly danger he is running into. If I am successful, I think it was a fine therapeutic achievement. Afterwards, I see, if he did not take my advice, that it was just the right thing for him to run into this danger. And this raises the question, did he not have to be in danger of death? If he had dared nothing, if he had not risked his life, perhaps he would have been poorer by a supremely important experience. He would never have risked his life and therefore would never have gained it. And so that idea certainly applies to many men from my generation who decided to avoid service in the U.S. military in order to avoid going to Vietnam. And many of them feel guilt now that they didn't go to Vietnam. And whenever they comment on that guilt to me, what I tell them is, well, that's all right. I went so that you wouldn't have to go. And I hope that makes them feel better. But the point is that people have to make mistakes. People sometimes have to do something that might be dangerous to them, or it may be potentially harmful to their family, a member of their family, or whatever, but it may ultimately be the right thing to do. And so that's kind of what the plot of Welcome to Happiness is about, is people who have that kind of confrontation with a very difficult decision. And they make that decision, and it often works out for the best, one way or another. So Dr. Jung's point is that he can't tell when he gives someone a piece of advice whether it's the right piece of advice. And I have certainly intervened in various people's lives a few times, and sometimes those interventions are very healthy and very good and very helpful, but sometimes they've been pure disasters, and that's just me operating as a boss or a friend, and you just can't get away from that. But anyway, yeah. So my point is that it's not so easy to set specific rules of life, and I do understand that Dr. Peterson was working from his clinical experience, and so he's run into a lot of people who had hardships of one sort or another, and so he's trying to offer guidelines that will be helpful to most people, but not always. It doesn't always work that way, and so it's something to think about anyway. So paragraph 866, Dr. Jung is saying that he does not mean that he relativizes good and evil. Okay, something might be good. This is where he's saying that, and therefore he's saying, you have to be humble and just make the best decision you can. And in 867, he points out that perhaps he must experience the power of evil and suffer accordingly. And my comment is, well, maybe we all do. I mean, in the United States, it's quite obvious that we had a humongous shadow developing in the country. And that has now come out very clearly, and maybe that we had to suffer the shadow taking over our country for a while, and maybe it'll be for 4 years or less, but maybe it'll be the next 20 years. We just don't know, because we don't know how things will work out. And so, but maybe the suffering of that experience of dealing with our national shadow will make us a better country. I hope so. But as Dr. Jung is saying, perhaps only such a drastic experience can strike home and make the point to various people. And I'd refer you to the demonstrators for neo-Nazis in Washington, D.C. A couple weeks back. They came to D.C., and I think that Steve Bannon and a few other people thought that they could regenerate the Hitler-type movement in the United States by doing this sort of stuff. And what they found out was that they couldn't, okay, because they were supposed to have this huge demonstration 2 weeks ago or 10 days ago in Washington, and only 24 people showed up compared to thousands who were demonstrating against them. And so all of a sudden you say, oh my God, maybe I'm out of touch here. At least so I think, anyway. I was going to read another portion of this. Okay, so in the context of this drastic experience that sometimes you need, I'm going to just read a little portion of paragraph 867, which is, how can anyone find out how much he needs to be saved if he is quite sure that there is nothing he needs saving from? He sees his own shadow, his crookedness, but he turns his eyes away, does not confront himself, does not come to terms with himself, risks nothing, and then boasts before God and his fellows of his spotless white garment, which in reality he owes only to his cowardice, his regression, his superangelic perfectionism, and instead of being ashamed, he stands in the front row of the temple and thanks God he is not as other men. And so the point is that, I guess the point of all of this is that sometimes you need an experience in order to know how bad things are. And so John says the temptation to do good, to help people, is a temptation indeed. And this is what I'm saying, John, that I've tried to help people a couple of times and I caused disaster instead in the context of my career. Good evening, Islam Ahmadiyat. And you say you're Muslim? Well, that's fine. Welcome. I've spent a lot of time in Muslim countries. I've been to 12 Muslim countries, and I've spent probably 2.5 years in various Muslim countries during my career. Dan says, the process of individuation necessarily means that mistakes will be made. Each will have his own way and perspective on whether or not specific events were good or bad within the larger picture. Absolutely. Dan, you definitely have totally grokked the idea of individuation, I must say that. And so, so in paragraph 868, the question is, do you know from what you have to be saved? And Dr. Jung refers to one of his favorite quotes from Christ, which is that Christ comes upon a man on the Sabbath. And I'm sorry I don't have the biblical passage right this minute, but I may be able to find it later on and put it on the playback. But the quote is, man, if thou knowest what thou doest, thou art blessed. But if thou knowest not, thou art accursed and a transgressor of the law. And so the example that I often give is the traffic laws, where perhaps you see a series of red stoplights ahead of you, for example, or you come to a stop sign and you know you can pass across the intersection safely, but it's illegal to do so. Well, if you know what you're doing, if you know you're out there in the prairie, let's say, and you come to a stop sign and you can see 5 miles in each direction, and you know you don't have to fully stop, then perhaps you know what you're doing. But if you don't know, then you might be a transgressor of the law. And so I think all of us probably speed at 7 to 10 miles over the speed limit, if not more in some cases. And, that's all well and good. That's sort of baked in the cake in the American traffic laws. In other words, police officers won't arrest you for being 7 miles over the speed limit, typically. But if you kill someone speeding like that, then you've got a real problem with your conscience, not to mention a problem with the law if you get caught because you caused an accident like that. And so then you're accursed and a transgressor of the law. And so, this is a precept of Jesus Christ himself. So I guess we can all think of times when we break the law in little ways, hopefully little ways, that are not harmful to anyone. And if we know what we're doing, then it's okay, according to Christ. But if you don't know what you're doing, or you don't know that your car might have a bad tire on it, that when you go faster tonight, it's going to blow a tire and cause a horrendous accident, and if you don't know that, then you're a transgressor of the law. And so in that situation, you have a chance of being blessed by a priest or whoever, but in the meantime, you are going to be in hell. And I mean in a living hell, not a mythical hell. And Dr. Jung makes the emphatic statement here: for the evil you do, even when you do it knowingly, is still evil, and it works accordingly. So, what I would observe is that karma works perfectly. And karma is a Buddhist and Hindu idea for what goes around comes around. So you may do something wrong over here, and while you're musing about the fact of your evil doing over here, you might have a traffic accident over here. And so it's not that if you cheat on your wife or do something like that, that you're going to get directly penalized for that. But your psyche knows that you've violated that principle of staying faithful to your spouse, and it will pay you back in a different way. And that seems to work perfectly. So, and it may not have to do with either of the relationships. So just be very careful, because the psyche knows, the shadow knows. So anyway, Dr. Jung makes this observation, though, that if there's no evil, then there's no greater miracle of redemption. So you can't be redeemed if you haven't committed some evil. And but evil remains evil, and we have to learn to think in paradoxes, as he puts it. And let's see. Dan says, would Christ therefore condone recreational drug use if it aligns with the individual's morality? I don't know. I think that you need to ask the inner Christ for the answer to that. I'm certainly not going to condone recreational drug use. my grandfather died of alcoholism, and that was, for his generation, that was recreational drug use. And my father was on oxygen for 15 years because he smoked for 60 years. And so, and he went down from being a fairly strong man to 112 pounds. So he was like a bag of bones at one point in his life. And so those are drugs. Alcohol is a drug, and nicotine is a drug. And I'm not really going to go into the other ones because, we saw 71 people, I think they died up in Boston in one weekend because of using recreational drugs. And so I guess it depends on where you get them, but you probably, if you're going to use recreational drugs, you should get them from a reliable source, and you don't have the FDA to help you. I think you have to be careful what you wish for. I mean, I just know of so many issues that come up around recreational drugs, including the fact that two people in my close acquaintance, including my brother-in-law's stepson, died from overdoses in the last 15 months. And we're currently killing 62,000 people. We killed 62,000 people in the United States with opioids in 2017. And so if you're going to mess with recreational drugs, you better really, really know what you're doing in the context of Christ's statement. Man, if you know what you're doing, basically is saying, if you know what you're doing, you're blessed, but if you don't know what you're doing, you're breaking the law. And so if you know what you're doing with recreational drugs, maybe it can be helpful. But these days you're really taking your life in your hands if you're buying drugs illegally and on the street, because you've got no idea what they're giving you. Thomas says, be aware of state laws also. Absolutely. You can end up in the slam for years. John says, it's possible Christ took a drug in the desert for 40 days. Most popular drugs nowadays are designed to lower you though. I wouldn't know. I mean, if there's any evidence of that in the Bible, I guess that's the only place we would know, and I don't recall any reference to any kind of drug in the desert, but who knows? In my case, I mean, obviously, Christ had a psychogenic experience when he had the experience with the devil, and since I've had a psychogenic experience that involved the devil, I know that that's quite possible to happen without taking drugs, and I was not taking drugs when it happened. Dan, as far as psychedelics are concerned, I have a very good friend who has a congenital disorder, which I'm not going to discuss, but he says that, and it's a family disorder that apparently has been passed on to a child of his, and he's thinking about getting that child into a program at the University of Maryland that involves psychedelics, and he says he feels he may have been cured in the 1960s by taking psychedelics recreationally. And so, yeah, okay, again, if you know what you're doing, then you're blessed. But if you don't know, you're a transgressor of the law, and you can easily die. And it's shocking what's happened, and it's shocking to lose people that are that close. And 62,000 people is 4,000 more than the number of people that were killed in Vietnam in the American military. And so are we going to build a wall for the 62,000 people a year that are dying from overdoses? I don't think so. And so there's a lot of tragedy out there. So Thomas says, arriving late, I'm curious how the conversation turned this way. Well, we're talking about good and evil. Thomas. And it's a subjective issue, but anyway. So in paragraph 869, Dr. Jung is saying that the great principles, good and evil are principles, entangle us in something, and God leaves it to us to find our way out. Now, keeping in mind that human beings are problem-solving creatures, and so we get ourselves in jams, and some of those are ethical jams. And Dr. Jung makes this tongue-in-cheek comment, in critical situations, the hero always misplaces his weapon. And so, for example, he talks about just before death, and you're confronted with the nakedness of this fact that, there's no way out, you're going to die, and you don't have a weapon to fight back, and you have to be able to react as the whole man or the whole woman as these things are happening to you. And you alone see the situation from the inside with the absolute, and nobody else sees it from the inside. And so you have to make your decision. Thomas says, there is the MAPS program, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, who has some impressive stuff going on. Those interested might check out the organization. Yeah, I'm not going to endorse any such thing. And honestly, I have a little bit of alcohol occasionally, not very often, but otherwise I didn't have asthma, or I didn't have nicotine like my father did, because his nicotine gave me asthma. And so when you hear my voice being gravelly, that's my father's nicotine still reacting to me 60 years after the fact. But anyway, Dr. Jung was in this essay. This is actually a presentation he was making to prospective therapists. And in paragraph 870, he points out that in order to keep a professional secret, sometimes he has to lie. And I just asked the sort of rhetorical question, what would you have the priests and bishops in Pennsylvania do? Those are some serious issues, but obviously the Catholic Church has got itself seriously wrapped around a crank over these sexual issues. And we had the example up in Boston about 15, 20 years ago, where where the behaviors in Massachusetts were exposed. And now, even though that happened, we still have the situation in Pennsylvania where 300 priests have been indicted. And if it's that many in Pennsylvania, I wonder how many there are in Texas and in California and in New York that have similar problems. And so here's the Catholic Church, which is supposed to be providing moral guidance for its parishioners, and I don't see where they have any room for talking about that anymore. It's going to be a very tough time for the Catholic Church. And I think already, because of the last round, 17 dioceses have gone bankrupt, among other things, but and many priests have been defrocked. And it's not only in Catholicism. My wife has been involved in a Buddhist group for 25 years, and she's done all the right things in that group, and suddenly the founder of that group has been accused of some various abuses, both sexual and violence, and it causes a group of 40,000 people to suddenly just collapse, kind of. And my wife has now left that group. And so these sorts of issues, we all have to make our own judgments, and we have to advise our young people, that we have to teach our young people to make judgments properly, because it seems that we cannot rely on officials, we can't rely on churches to properly do it. And as far as I'm concerned, they need to prove themselves going on. Thomas says, total abstainer from all substances at present myself, though I see little good in prohibition, although a case could be made for the use of alcohol as a great evil. Well, the case for alcohol as a great evil has been made by pastors forever. But, for my lights, I think that we ought to legalize drugs and then regulate them, legalize and regulate them. And if we did that, we would cut the crime very severely in many ways, and we would probably save a lot of lives. And, why the powers that be don't do that is a big question. But I think if we're going to legalize them, then there has to be a lot more knowledge about what is going on and what you're ingesting into your body. Dan says, how do you get through the day without coffee? Rhetorical question, just wanted to identify my main vice. Well, actually, coffee's never done very much for me. I don't know why. I mean, I do have sort of the equivalent of 3 cups a day, but it's mainly always because my wife wants to. And up until the time I went to Japan when I was 32, in business I mean, I never drank coffee or tea at all. And I got to Japan and I hired a young woman to be my assistant, and the result was that every 2 hours for the next 5 years, either coffee or tea or soup would appear on my desk, whether I wanted it or not. And many times it would be this Japanese green tea, which has matcha in it, and so it's a special caffeine in matcha. And so I drank all that caffeine for that 5-year period, and still I'm not addicted to caffeine. I don't know why, but I know a lot of people that are addicted to it, and I think that from my point of view, I like the ritual of it very much. For example, I make coffee for my wife every morning and for me, and I like that ritual, but it's not because the caffeine helps me. Thomas says, as I've aged, the indistinguishability of the two streams, good and evil, has begun to stand out sharply in what I see happening in the world. Good priests or Rinpoches involved in bad practices, yeah. And good is in parentheses. And Thomas's comment. John says, one thing to remember is that coffee makes you more susceptible to manipulation, persuasion, which is one reason it's pushed so much. That's a new one on me, John. That may be true. I don't know. Certainly, alcohol works that way. And Thomas says, Dan, coffee is my one drug. See Balzac for coffee abuse problems. My yoga teacher swore caffeine screwed up her breathing and did not help her in meditation. Well, yeah, I never have had a problem getting into meditation either. So anyway, Deborah says, can any individual, including priests, teachers, gurus, etc., be considered good if they engage in evil behavior? Well, surely not. But I think the lesson from Dr. Jung is that we each have to make our own judgments about that, and we have to put distance between ourselves and those people when they are evil. And we have to teach our children and our spouses the right way to avoid evil. Thomas says, I think also of good or great artists whose lives, apart from what they create, contain personal evil, great personal evil. Well, I definitely relate to that, Thomas, because one of my favorites, because of my experience with one of his paintings, is Jackson Pollock, and he obviously abused alcohol at the minimum and ended up killing himself and a couple of young women in an auto accident at age 44. And I think that what happens is the best art comes archetypally from the unconscious, and the best artists can channel that power, that creative stream from their unconscious. And when, for example, writers talk about writer's block, they're talking about the inability to reconnect with this stream of creativity that comes from the unconscious. And so I think that a lot of creative people have tried to use drugs or alcohol as a way to reconnect. And that seems to be a big mistake. It might produce, for 2 or 3 years perhaps, something, unbelievable. And in a sense, it is unbelievable because there might have been, moral qualms about doing this particular kind of art, let's say. And I think that what happens is that a lot of artists just, try to take a shortcut back into the unconscious so they get the stream going. And so I've talked about the novel that I wrote, and that was, wow, an amazing experience for 8 months where it just flowed out of me. But that novel had, putting it in the kindest way, erotica in it. And it was because of that erotica that I put the novel in my drawer for 21 years and didn't publish it. Now I think I understand it. I think I understand my shadow a bit better. And so I have published it. And anybody that has access to our Dropbox has access to an electronic version of it anyway. If you're curious about, what did Skip write? You can see that. I've had a lot of people tell me that they like what they read there. But anyway, I can say that it was a very good feeling having that come from the unconscious. And even though I haven't written anything like that since 1993, I know I can turn that on anytime. Okay, it's not a question of a writer's block. It's a question of I don't choose to turn that stream on at this point in time. And so if anybody has writer's block and wants to talk to me about that privately, I'll be happy to tell you how to get it going again. Deborah says, seems as if the discussion here around substances that are drugs are being assumed to be evil in their essence. Well, I don't know, because there are plenty of drugs that have helped me over time. I took 2 ibuprofen right before this class. So, we do use drugs, and I've had 2 major surgeries on my legs in the last 15 months. I had a knee replaced and an ankle replaced. And what I found was that, okay, we've got pain under control, no problem. And I personally had no problem switching out of the narcotic, but I know that the doctors who do those surgeries are always being asked by people to give them more of their anti-pain drug. And in the case of my ankle, I stopped the narcotic drug after 24 hours. And in the case of the knee, after about 3 days, because I don't want to get pulled down that path. And so if you know what you're doing, there are uses for it, but there are also abuses. John says, I've considered the idea of a society where ingesting a drug is initiation into adulthood. In our current age, that is alcohol, but it could be something better. Well, I think that there are a lot of societies where that happens, okay, and some of them are primitive, there are drugs that are in common use. Psychedelic type drugs that are common use in some countries. And they may serve some good purpose, not just evil. I'm not saying that they're evil in their essence. If a drug makes an abusive husband blotto so that he doesn't abuse his wife, maybe that's doing a good thing. I don't know. Let's see. Thomas says, in my past experience with mostly the psychedelic range of drugs, it would be hard to define their effects as evil so much as problematic. Laws against their use also create a negative. Deborah says, Thomas, I understand, just find it interesting that this talk on good and evil in analytical psychology has ended up with this focus on drugs, just an observation, no judgment intended. Well, okay, so actually in Dr. Jung's essay, there is no mention of drugs. And so Anyway, Dr. Jung was saying that in order to keep a professional secret, sometimes he had to lie. And so, these things come up, especially for people who are in the legal profession or in people who are psychotherapists, and they have confidentiality understandings with their clients. As Dr. Jung says in paragraph 871, philosophy butters no parsnips. So, if you're in that line of work or you're in the law and you have attorney-client privilege, you can't reveal your secrets. And he says nothing is as clear as 2 times 2 equals 4. He says conventional morality is exactly like classical physics, that is, statistical truth and statistical wisdom. Now, if you know anything about Dr. Jung from some of my earlier classes, you will know that he detested statistics. And he once, or maybe more than once, made the comment, bring me a normal man and I will fix him for you. And his point is, and by normal he meant average, because his point is that there is no such thing as an average person. And he just gave the example of a large bucket, let's say, a huge bucket, and you fill it with stones that are this big, and you fill it up to the top, and then you ask somebody, is that full? And they see that it's full of these big rocks, and then he says, okay, and then he takes gravel and he puts the gravel in over the big rocks, and sure enough, he can get a lot of gravel in there too. And so then he says, is that full? And the person says yes, and then he says, okay. So then he puts sand in, and he finds that he can put a lot of sand in over the gravel and the rocks. And so then he says, is that full? And the person says yes, and then he says, okay. Then he takes water, and he fills it up to the top with water, and then it is full. But in each of those cases, the statistics would say that the container was full. And that's the way statistical truth and statistical wisdom work. And so in the Marine Corps, we learn a fundamental idea that Marine Corps officers have to know, which is you have to know the situation and the terrain. And so if you're going to break a rule, you need to know the situation and the terrain. You're not going to light up a marijuana cigarette in front of the police department because that wouldn't be knowing either the situation or the terrain. But anyway, Dr. Jung is saying that we cannot say that our judgments are absolutely valid. So he basically said, learn all the rules, learn everything you can, and then forget them, and face your client or your patient as an individual. So let's see. So Thomas says, perhaps drugs are the archetypal expression of what the snake was selling in the Garden of Eden story. Yep. And Deborah says, I know that Freud used cocaine, not remembering if Jung did as well. Actually, Jung was mostly a teetotaler, but not because of any firm decision about being a teetotaler. I mean, he didn't have a strict rule about not drinking, but he just never got very interested in it. He got drunk one time as a student, I think, and I think he didn't like the experience. And Freud did get into a problem with cocaine, but this was because he had cancer of the jaw, and it was very painful to him. And there is a book called, I forget what it's called, but it's a book by Irving Stone, who wrote a number of historical novels, and one of them is about Freud, and his description of the surgery that Freud went through when they removed a big part of his jaw is just horrific. And so you wouldn't be surprised that in that day and age he would be using whatever he had access to in that situation. Dan says, I think we could have just as easily focused on sexual taboos. It just seems to me that experimenting with psychedelic drugs has had a resurgence symptomatic of longing for spiritual experiences. And Thomas says, well said, and I agree with that. But the cost of that was 62,000 lives in the United States last year, so we need to rethink that one a bit. Dan says Jung is the only drug I need. And I pretty much feel the same way, Dan, as you probably know, as you do know. Thomas says, I read a biography where Siggy was quite the advocate of Siggy being Freud, was quite the advocate of cocaine until he saw the problem, but this was before his cancer in his younger years. I'm not an expert on Freud, so you probably know more than I do. Thomas says, Freud used it early in his career, not after cancer, I believe. Okay, I don't remember. And obviously the Irving Stone book is a historical novel. If you haven't read Irving Stone's historical novels, I highly recommend them to you. They're very engaging, and most of them are available on Audible. And there is this one very good one that I can speak about that is a Freud novel, or a Freud story. My favorite one was actually, I think it's called Greek Treasure, and it's about the excavation of Troy and of Mycenae in Greece. But it turns out that it's actually a biography of Heinrich Schliemann, who is the man who did the early excavation of Troy, and he did it as an archaeological dig. He got down 4 civilizations in this dig, and he thought he had found Troy, and actually now they've gotten down to something like 11 civilizations in that same place. And so he didn't find Troy, but when he was in his mid-50s, married a Greek woman who was 17 when they married, and ultimately it was after his death that she went around the world talking about his archaeological work, and it turned out that she was actually the Greek treasure. And yeah, I don't know. This is Bill W., I think, isn't it, Thomas? I'm not sure. Bill H. is the correct reference. Can we agree that good and evil create a world of gray rather than pristine whites and blacks? Certainly that is true, and that's the message of this essay overall. And I'll just get through a few more points here. So one of Dr. Jung's points in paragraph 872 is that we end up being faced with a strange double effect, and suddenly we see both sides. Once one stands a few times between the opposites, you see what is meant by self. And in terms of then self, in 873, he's referring to the Hindu idea of Atman, and he's and saying that, in effect, that that's the self, and that the self speaks through you. And then we have Atman Purusha, that which speaks through all, a psychic totality. And that would be something like the collective unconscious, as I described it a couple of weeks ago, where any organization has its own kind of collective unconscious, and the United States has a collective unconscious. It has obviously different pockets of shadow and light side, and but they are the overall thing. The Atman Purusha is how the self is speaking through all of us. And so the one time we get to do that is on election day. So I urge everyone to go out and vote in November. In paragraph 874, consciousness experiences So consciousness experiences good and evil as something numinous, and it's an experiential character of this totality. And so once you are in your life, and I'm an old guy, so I've had a few of these experiences, and I do see that once you're in the middle of these things, they are numinous. And it may be a vessel for divine grace. And so then I made this comment that it may be divine grace for the neo-Nazis that came to D.C. week before last, because the grace is that they learn that there's not this huge group building that's going to take over the United States in a psychic epidemic, as they did in Nazi Germany. So in 875, he's saying, I free myself from totality by being in the middle. Only there am I no longer at the mercy of the opposites. But you have to take a position in the opposites as well. Deborah says, I was just thinking of good and evil in terms of transcendent function and the holding of the opposites. Yeah, I mean, well, let's put it this way. Edward Edinger was asked how to have an experience with the greater personality in one of the lectures that I've referred to many times. And he said you have to reflect on what you love or hate, and that will put you in the middle. So then that's how you can have a numinous experience coming up from that. So there were a few questions of Dr. Jung's students in this article, which was actually a talk of Dr. Jung's. And there's this one funny comment in paragraph 876. He's responding to questions from the audience, and he says, who takes longer to be saved, the man who loves God or the man who hates him? I guess this is a Hindu gotcha question. Are there any thoughts on this? Who takes longer to be saved, the man who loves God or the man who hates him? And how long does it take? Are there any guesses? Okay. According to the Hindus, the man who loves God takes 7 years to be saved, but the man who hates God takes only 3 years because he thinks about him more often. No guesses. Okay. So then in 879, he's saying that the devil is a special reality for us today. And the devil is today unique and frightful because all of the divine powers are being placed in man's hands. And of course, during his late lifetime, he was mainly worried about thermonuclear war, as we all are at one level or not. But he says evil is terribly real for each and every individual. If you regard the principle of evil as a reality, you can just as well call it the devil. And he says he just can't believe in this concept of privatio boni, which is the idea that there is no such thing as evil, but it's only a privation of good, which is what was sold by the church for 2,000 years. And so anyway, in 880, he was asked whether he could tell a patient what to do, and he said, no, it has to grow from within naturally. You have to say the right thing at the right time and place. And so obviously that's a very delicate thing, and when you're in one of these numinous situations, you have to know when you can talk about something and when you can't. So, Deborah, I'm not quite sure how you mean your comment about good and evil in terms of the transcendent function, because in Dr. Jung's oeuvre, the transcendent function normally refers to a duality between unconscious and conscious. And I suppose you could say that there could be an evil part of you that's unconscious, and there's a good part of you. I mean, I can imagine young women in their Sunday school dress being good Miss Goody Two Shoes, and so she's Miss Perfect, and unconsciously there might be some evil in there. And I think that when that breaks through, yes, that is a transcendent experience one way or another. So anyway, in 882, he's again advising these student therapists, and he says, everything suggestive of illness should be avoided. I treat them as normal people. In other words, he didn't want his patients to wallow in the idea that they were sick. He wanted them to consider themselves normal people, because if they lie down and they think that they're ill, then that's a psychosomatic thing. And then he makes this comment, yet the danger that faces us today is that the whole of reality will be replaced by words. This accounts for that terrible lack of instinct in modern man. And modern man lacks contact with life. And so this is my logos versus eros argument that I've been making for quite some time now, where I couldn't accept Dr. Peterson's 12 Rules of Life book completely, because it seemed to me to be all logos all the time, and it was a strict father telling you what you can and cannot do. And, what we have to understand is that the Holy Bible is just a doorstop unless you put your own life into it. It's a black book with some ancient stories in it. But other than that, it's nothing special unless you put your life into it. And that means the eros side, and that means feeling the experience of, feeling the experience of the Holy Ghost, or whatever it is that you may be following through the Bible. And so when people say that, it's purely the word, and the word has to be followed faithfully, and every word is true. Well, no, they're not. They're not true at all in that sense. And so, what is true is that Christ represents the self for a quarter of the human race. But it's not the case that happened because every word in the Bible is true, because we started to get away from that in about 1500, and we have to grow up and face the world as it actually is. And we can have guidance from the Bible, certainly, but we also have to understand what it means in our heart. And so, what I say is that, okay, I was raised as a Christian, and when I became a Buddhist, it made me a better Christian. And when I started to study Jung and became a Jungian, that made me both a better Christian and a better Buddhist. And so, we need to understand ourselves and how we work as human beings. But anyway, he's concluding here with, almost concluding, paragraph 883, good and evil is only our judgment in a given situation. The primordial powers put us in situations, and there's no way out but God, a numinous experience. Okay, so in other words, there's a conflict of duties, you don't know which way to turn, and something has to give you an answer. It's a vision or a dream or something that makes a decision for you. And so what Dr. Jung was saying in that paragraph 746 that I was talking about at the beginning about individuation is that you either understand yourself and understand what these you understand yourself and what these messages from the unconscious actually mean, in which case you can enter into life walking upright. But if you don't understand yourself, then you're going to get dragged into it anyway, and then you'll call it fate. But you might be able to control your fate to a certain extent if you understand your instincts a bit better. Deborah says, my thought may be moot, as I am not yet sure of the phenomenology of good and evil, that they do not exist in and of themselves, but only in relativity. Well, Dr. Jung refers to them as principles, and they exist as principles. And And so there's nobody writing a holy book that can tell you what's good and what's evil. It depends on the situation and the terrain, I think. And that's, I mean, this is from a psychologist's point of view, and I'm not professing to say anything about anybody's religious point of view or anybody's other ways of thinking about good and evil other than from a psychological point of view. And in that sense, it depends on the situation. I mean, if you murder somebody, maybe that was the right thing to do if you knew that that person was going to murder 100 other people the next day. Who knows? I mean, you can come up with all sorts of fact situations where something could come up that you would do something that you never imagined you would ever do. What if we have a thermonuclear weapon go off in our community? What then? What would you do to survive? And what would you do to help your family survive in that situation? So anyway, Dr. Jung's suggestion is to be judicious in advising patients and to see what turns up in dreams. And his point is that therapists are not God and shouldn't be behaving as if they are. And in 885, he's saying that beware the unconscious does not play another trick and prevent the confrontation. So in other words, the unconscious could throw up a way to escape the interplay between the opposites, and that might not be so good either. And then finally, he's talking about secrets, and he's talking about the secrets of esoterica. Well, as you probably know, I don't consider most esoterica as wooey woo. I think they work in various ways. For example, if we take the tarot or the tea leaves or the I Ching or whatever it is that you're doing. I've had a reading done out of coffee grounds. People have done it various ways. And in those cases, those are people that are simply connecting with the hooks in your psyche and bringing to the fore something that you weren't thinking about. That's basically what it is. And so Dr. Jung was kvetching about the fact that he's often criticized for studying esoterica. And, his point was that, somebody's got to study it. And he says the real secrets cannot be revealed. So, yeah, I would say that that's true in, let's say I do a tarot reading for you, and I can tell you in advance that I'm not doing anything that's magical in a tarot reading, but nonetheless, I can say something that will trigger something that's either very positive or very negative in your psyche. And I can't know that I'm doing that because tarot is a very blunt instrument, actually. I mean, if you can teach it to 9th grade high school girls, it's not very refined. But anyway, the secret that causes that reaction in you, there's a secret that's happening, but that can't be told, how it happens or how I successfully hit on that nerve. And Dr. Jung has emphasized throughout his oeuvre that man needs secrets. Since he doesn't know the real ones, he fakes them. The real ones come from the depths. If he reveals, it may be too much. And he's talking about the numinous character of reality, that the real secrets come up from the depths, and they're not the secret of, oh, well, I can throw the tarot cards across the stage and do a reading without any layout, and it will have meaning to everyone in the auditorium. That is a true statement, but what makes it true is a secret that I don't know and no one in the room knows, but everyone in the room can possibly feel that I have done the reading for them individually. And that is because the tarot cards are based on the archetypes. And so if I say enough, I'm going to hit everybody's archetype. And his point, he makes this final statement here, is not we who have secrets, it is the real secrets that have us. And so that's a very interesting perspective. Now then, let's go back. Dan says, in my experience, psychologists tend to treat you as sick, which tends to render the treatment ineffective. Yes, that would be Dr. Jung's position as well. Thomas says, my Jungian therapist certainly didn't do that. It was more like a deep conversation with a kindred soul, which is from a Jungian perspective. Dan, I don't think you're talking about a Jungian, if I'm not mistaken, but maybe you can clarify that point. Deborah says, Von Franz talks about things such as the Tarot, I Ching, astrology, etc., as being forced synchronicities. I found that interesting. Yep, that would be a way of referring to it too. In other words, what you're doing is, you're saying enough things so that it will connect with something in the psyche. And the way a synchronicity works is that you have a certain readiness in your psyche, and then something happens, and therefore you somehow make a connection that suggests that those things are connected, but they are acausal. So synchronicity is called an acausal connecting principle. And so, yes, what you say about them being forced synchronicities would be exactly right. Dan says, a person that is in touch with their depths may not find cognitive behavioral therapy useful. No Jungians in my local geography. Yeah, that's what I'm afraid of. Let's see. Person is in touch with her. Yeah, I sort of am, what should I say? I'm sure that there is a place for therapists, and I'm not one, and I've never been to one actually, that's not true. With my ex-wife and I, we did go to 5 sessions with a therapist. I don't think he was a Jungian, and which I found a total waste of time. But I imagine that behavioral therapy is pretty superficial in terms of what we're talking about here. And Thomas says, Maria von Franz, no, it's Marie-Louise von Franz is the name. And she was one of the leading disciples of Dr. Jung, and she wrote quite a number of very valuable books. I'm trying to find time to read them myself. But I have read the Grail Legend, which she wrote based on the research of Emma Jung. And It's a terrific book. And by the way, I have on my desk here, I think Thomas last week brought up the Aurora Consurgens, which is a document attributed to Thomas Aquinas on the problem of opposites in alchemy. A document attributed to Thomas Aquinas on the problem of opposites in alchemy, edited with a commentary by Marie-Louise von France. And what I'm thinking of doing is reading at least the part attributed to Thomas Aquinas into the channel over the next few weeks, and we'll think about how we can talk about it. I know there's some interest in alchemy in this group. I was advised by my therapist, the only Jungian in town, to paint or draw the few dreams or numinous images I could come up with at the time. Our common interest made the time remarkably useful. And she remains a close friend. I have no doubt about that, and I recommend that also. Every time that I can capture a dream, I put it in a dream book, and if I can draw the image of the dream, although in a very rudimentary fashion, I do it. And one of our regular members, who was a physical member with me when we were doing this in Sammy's, does that regularly and very successfully as well. I'm glad. Deborah, are you an analyst by any chance? I'm just wondering. Sometimes I feel like I can get in her hurt because one or more Jungian analysts will come in and say, no, you're full of it, Skip. And that may be the case. I never know for sure. Okay, so I thought I would close this with another very short quote by Dr. Jung, which might generate some controversy here. Because one of the issues that often comes up when we talk about Dr. Jung's work is his activity, particularly in the 1930s in Germany. And so, in one case, he was attacked in the Saturday Review in the United States, and so he had this answer, which I'll read to you. And so let me read this to you. It's in italics. It says, "Mr. Hillier." Okay, so this is from C.G. Jung Speaking, Interviews and Encounters, edited by William McGuire and R.F.C. Hall, published by the Bollingen series of Princeton University Press. I'm on page 196. And so Jung puts in italics, Mr. Hillier claims that in 1936 you said that Hitler's new order in Germany seemed to offer the only hope for Europe, unquote. And so this is his response. Many Americans asked me what I thought about Hitler and his ideas in the autumn of 1936, and I always expressed concern for the future of Europe. It is not true that I ever admired Hitler. However, in the early years, before the power devil finally took the upper hand with Hitler, he brought about many reforms and to a certain extent served the German people constructively. I may have said something of this kind as well as talking to the dangers ahead, which I had already written about. If I state an historical fact, people immediately jump to the conclusion that that implies admiration, the mockery of it. My whole life work is based on the psychology of the individual and his responsibility both to himself and his milieu. Mass movements swallow individuals wholesale, and an individual who thus loses his identity has lost his soul. Such a widespread phenomenon has well nigh destroyed our civilization, and the danger is by no means over yet. Hitler became the mouthpiece of all the undercurrents seething in the German people. This fact was aptly expressed by the oft-repeated phrase that Hitler followed his intuition with the false, quote, assurance and accuracy of a sleepwalker, unquote, until he came to the edge of the precipice from which there was no escape. In my paper on Wotan, I described how the wind god of old provided a very apt picture of the force which seized on the German people, stirring up the long-buried barbaric past. I wrote this article in 1936 as a warning for those who could understand its implications. When the unconscious of a whole people is stirred to such an extent, and there is no conscious and responsible leader to canalize the released forces, then the devil takes hold and the destructive forces rush headlong to their final destruction, but only after half destroying the world around them. That is the tragedy. Anyone who takes the trouble to read what I wrote, both before and during the war, will find my real views concerning mass psychology and its dangers, but my warning voice was not heard. Okay, so that's one piece of it. There was an evening when I talked about this in group, and I believe it was the 4th session of the group. So it's in a playlist called JRG1, and it was the evening in which I discussed the movie A Dangerous Method. And that's about a 50-minute video there, and you can hear quite a bit more about my response to this. But some of you may know that Dr. Jung worked as a secret agent for Alan Dulles during World War II. Alan Dulles was then the head of the Office of Strategic Services, now the CIA, in Europe, and he was stationed in Bern during the war. And Dr. Jung worked with him extensively during the war, but that's a story for another night. And Thomas comments, there's a great, rather old video called Wisdom of the Dream that is useful as an introduction to Jung's thought if anyone needs or wants it. And I think there's one other besides that, which is the, that may have been the BBC Dream one, I don't know, but there is also the Hudson videos, the Houston films. So in this book, C.G. Jung Speaking, Interviews, and Encounters, they actually have a transcript of the Houston films, and so that's in C.G. Jung Speaking, Interviews, and Encounters. So Deborah says, I am a depth psychologist, just finished my PhD. Congratulations. So if you keep coming to our weekly meetings, you can keep me honest. And also our advanced reading group meetings, which are now conducted on Wednesdays at 1:30 p.m. on video conference. We use Zoom for that. So if that interests you, you can write to me at skip.conover@gmail.com, and I will be happy to talk to you about joining the advanced group, where I am doing a meticulous discussion of ion, where all the videos are recorded, and they are in a special Dropbox for the advanced group. And I completed last week up through paragraph 98, and I think there's something like 490. I probably can say here, because somewhere here I have ion. Under which pile? I don't see it right offhand at the moment, but it must be here somewhere. Anyway, there's about 470 paragraphs, so just over a fifth of the way through. So I'm delighted to have you here, though. Thomas says, painting for me as a writer would bring up stuff writing would not. I agree with that, Thomas. What I found, and I'm not a great painter, but I did paint a lot for about 10 years. And what I found was that when I was painting, my life worked better. And I don't know why, it's a mystery, but nonetheless, it's true that when I was painting, my life worked better. And what I think is that it's also when I'm doing something creative. So now I've been creatively trying to build this YouTube channel, and since 2010, the Archetype in Action website. And those things have sort of displaced my painting for me. But because they are creative activities, they open the channels to the unconscious. And I have a series of tricks that I use to try to get the best out of my unconscious or my right brain. And one of them is I always listen to the telephone in my left ear. And so the left ear is attached to the right brain. And I find there's a qualitative difference between how I hear something if I hear it in the left ear versus the right ear. And so, often I do listen to things in both ears with a headset, but when I talk on the telephone, I find that I'm more creative in my business life if I use my left ear on the telephone. Deborah says, hope to go on for analytical training if Psyche agrees. Absolutely. Let's see. Yeah, Wisdom of the Dream is available on YouTube anyway. And Dan says, how many Jungian books do you have in your personal library? Innumerable. I don't know. There's at least 3 shelves of them. I don't have room for everything. I have about 10 of them stacked up in front of me here. But anyway, so Deborah says she'll contact me. I guess she means me. I've been interested in your groups, but find it confusing. I am just learning YouTube. Okay, well, if you go to the homepage of the YouTube channel, you will find that I've tried to organize it somewhat. There are now 707, and this will be the 708th video that are online, so there's quite a pile to look at. In year one, in the first 5 months or so, we talked about man and his symbols. And then we talked about the book about Emma Jung, and that took about 5 or 6 weeks. And then in the spring of year one, we did talk about Answer to Job somewhat. And then in the summer, which was last summer in 2017, I had my knee replaced, and so I began to do readings. And so starting in probably late July or early August of last year, I started to read Answer to Job. So you can find the complete playlist of Answer to Job on the site, and I can actually, let me give you the link to that. For anyone who hasn't read Answer to Job, you really need to read it. And that's one of the most important books in Dr. Jung's oeuvre, and you can just listen to it while you're commuting to work. And so I'll just give you the link. That's the Answer to Job playlist. And you will find that the first video in that is out of order, because in that video there is a numinous experience which occurred to me, and it undoubtedly will not be quite as numinous for you as it was for me, but for me it was an extremely powerful experience. And it begins in paragraph 746, right in the middle of the part that I was reading earlier this evening. And just at the break between paragraph 746 and 747, a very numinous thing occurred from my perspective. And you can, because I recognize that this was numinous from my point of view, I just left the camera going while I continued to read. And so in that video, if you listen to the first sentence and then go to 2 minutes and 9 seconds into the video and watch the actual event, and then you can go to 4 minutes 55 seconds into the video and watch my emotional experience starting to take hold, or it was actually starting through the rest of the video after the event, but it's a little more subtle until 4:55, and then at 6:45 there's another reaction to it. So you see my reaction to this event, and this was an event that no one, absolutely no one, could possibly fake, and you'll see why when you watch that video. Let's see. Thomas sounds like he's going back into the art business. That might be a good thing. And Deborah says, thanks, Thomas. Have enjoyed the session. Tony Sapanos says, I've just started interpreting my dreams from Robert Johnson's 4-step method. It's been very revealing with only 6 dreams I've really dug into. I'm sure that can be quite useful, and I have to admit that I haven't read any of Robert Johnson's books, but I know of his work, and I know it's recommendable. Although, in my experience, then after you've gotten sort of a comfort level with all these people that write about Jung and so on, then I urge you to get into Dr. Jung's direct material. I had put it off for 18 years, and I just read about him, and I thought that his work was mainly clinical and that it would be too difficult for me to understand, and boy was I ever wrong. And he was right up the alley of what I needed. And I was very surprised to find the material that is there about religion. And particularly this book. This is a book by Edward Edinger, The New God Image by Edward Edinger. And this is a very powerful book, but, because I've been arm wrestling with religion all my life, I really appreciate that book, which I read last summer while I was convalescing. And I had this interesting experience. There's this one video of Dr. Jung that is on YouTube, and you can put a search for it in Google or in YouTube itself, which is just put, I have no need to believe I know. But when I heard that video, Dr. Jung was being interviewed in the interview that Thomas mentioned above. He was being interviewed, and he was asked, do you now believe in God? And he said, oh, very complicated. I have no need to believe. I know. And when he said that in that video, even though he's been dead for, when I saw it the first time, he'd been dead for maybe 55 years, I suddenly had this inspiration myself, which was that I too know. And then, but I couldn't put my finger on why I know. And it was only with Edinger's book that I could understand it. And then in the last couple of days, my wife and I have discovered a video that is by a man named Ken Wilber. I don't know if you know his name, but he's quite an impressive guy. And this is an impressive video that's worth watching. And, maybe we'll talk about that video next week. It's 100 years after Jung, but basically he says, let's see, what is his basic mantra? He has a basic mantra. And what he's talking about, basic mantra is wake up, clean up, and grow up. And so what he's saying is that all the major religions refer to a satori type of experience, a religious experience. And that's what my experience in that Answer to Job video is about. That's a wake-up experience. That's a religious experience. So he says all the religions have a wake-up experience, but we have to not only wake up, we also have to clean up and grow up. And so cleaning up is cleaning up our emotions and the depth of our emotions, and growing up has to do with getting over the need for your religion to provide a magic puppeteer for you that's going to save you, okay? And so anyway, I can highly recommend this video with Ken Wilber, and we can talk about it a little bit next week if you want. And so Tony says, you're right. I read his material when I was younger, but it was hard for me to grasp, but it still captured me. The archetypes are tough to understand. 10 years later, I'm coming back to dig deeper. Well, Tony, on the archetypes, I would urge you to go read Jean Shinoda Boland's two books, Gods in Every Man and Goddesses in Every Woman. And those will sort of crystallize the idea of archetypes in you. And then you need to come back and talk about other archetypes, because the archetypes of the structure of the psyche you won't find there. But at least the concept of the archetypes is very clearly covered by Dr. Boland. And Deborah says, I don't believe I know my favorite quote of Jung's and how I knew I had found my tribe, so to speak. Me too. Thomas says, I've heard of Wilbur, but read none of his work. Well, give a half an hour to this video and then see if you don't want to watch the rest of it, which was my experience. And this video came to us from some very senior Buddhists in the Washington area, and they are people that I've known for 25 years who have been leaders in one of the Buddhist communities in the United States, along with my wife. And they were sharing this video among themselves. And so they shared it with my wife, who's also one of their tribe. And she listened to it on Saturday morning and said, you've got to listen to this. And so I would urge you to give it a listen and maybe listen to some of Ken Wilber's other work. He's got a number of books. And my wife had said to me, have you ever heard of Ken Wilber? And I said, oh yeah, I have two of his books on my desk. I just haven't read them yet. And so she was thrilled because I could give her the books that she wanted right away. And so anyway, I actually, I guess it was yesterday morning, I did a reading from two of his books, and you can find it. It'll be right in the most recent videos. In fact, I can probably tell you what it's called. Just a moment. Okay, so on the homepage of the YouTube channel, it is called Matter to Body to Mind to Soul to Spirit, Confused in Our Confusion. Got a very long name. Confused in Our Confusion on Truths Ancient and Modern. And so in that video, I did read several passages out of Ken Wilber's book, and it's probably worth listening to. And it's right on the homepage of this YouTube channel, so you can find it easily. Let's see, should I give it here? I can actually give you the link. We have this magic these days. Here's the link. That's my reading. What I did was I combined two of Ken Wilber's books plus a book by Jungian analyst Gary Sparks and a few of my own comments in that video. So it's a work. it's not just one reading straight. And so, Deborah, did you like Wilber? And, my sense is that Jung is still the sort of master tent peg of this entire thing. But Wilber has articulated out and amplified some of the things that Jung taught. And so it's worth understanding what he says here. Yeah, who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes. That's a great quote. Gary Sparks, another of my favorites. Well, here's Gary. Let's see. That one I do have in reach. Okay, so I was reading from this book, which is Carl Jung and Arnold Toynbee, A Social Meaning of Inner Work. And what I was doing in that video, I was talking about religious experiences, and I think I started with one of my own religious experiences. Can I show it here? Maybe. Let's see. Yes. All right. So this is my religious experience that I was talking about. And this came up because sometimes if I'm feeling low for some reason, I will go to the U.S. Naval Academy Chapel to meditate. And it's the Cathedral of the Navy, so it's a grand church, and it's quite close to my home. And if I go there in the morning, it's quite dark inside the building, but it's vacant and open to visitors. And so I go and I sit in one of the side pews. And so on this particular morning, I was feeling very glum. And I was sitting there meditating. And suddenly a light came in upon me. And it lit only me. And I was so taken by it that I said, wow, I have to take a picture of this. Nobody will ever believe it. So I took a picture. And so the top of this is the picture I took of the light shining down upon me. And if that's not a biblical experience, I don't know what is. Even my iPhone caught it. And the stained glass window in this picture is the one stained glass window in the chapel, which was designed by Tiffany. So it's a very special window. And then the lower picture, I just turned it around and took this selfie of myself. And you can see how my whole demeanor has become happy, and you can see how much I'm personally lit up in this image. And just so you know, in the back of this scene is it looks like there's a gargoyle coming over my shoulder, but actually that's the Great Seal of the U.S. Naval Academy behind me. But anyway, just for your information, I thought you might be interested in that, and that's also in the video that I did yesterday, so I won't bother you further with it. But that was a religious experience that I had a couple years back now. But anyway, in my video yesterday, I was just trying to express what a religious experience is like. And Sparks in this book talks about a religious experience. I guess he talks about religious experiences of Jung and Toynbee, but the one that I read yesterday was the Toynbee one. The ones of Dr. Jung are very well known, so I won't repeat them here for the moment. So you outgrew Wilbur, Deborah. That's interesting. Yeah, she says, Wilbur still has an agenda, and sometimes I found his ego gets in the way. Yes, he certainly has an institute that he's trying to promote. And so you just ordered the Jung Toynbee book? That's interesting. And so I'm glad we could talk about those things, but I think I have to wrap up because we're 2 hours and 10 minutes into the session. So YouTube, in their gentle mercies, may remove the beginning of this video, and so I need to end for tonight, but for those of you who are in the advanced group, I will be available on Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and I have just posted last week's video because I got delayed a little bit at the end of last week and didn't get it done until today. But it should be available in the Advanced Reading Group Dropbox. If you're not a member of our regular Dropbox, everyone should join that. And in order for me to put you into it, all you need to do is send me an email to skip.conover@gmail.com. I need your regular email address in order to give you access to the Dropbox. But anyway, any other questions, thoughts, or complaints before I wrap up for tonight? If any thoughts about, I guess I'm aiming toward doing something about Aurora Consurgens next week, and I'm not sure what that may be, but let's see what happens in the coming week. Nice talking to you all, and anyway, okay, I'm going to terminate the stream for tonight. I'll be available for another 2 or 3 minutes on the chat, and then we'll continue next week, Monday night at 8 p.m. and Wednesday at 1:30 for the advanced group. Thank you. Take care now. Bye.